Real Estate Radio, Chaz Koch of the One Team at William Raveis Real Estate here this week with Brian Skelly, the mortgage guru, breaking down all things Thanksgiving, as well as all things rates, as well as what's going on in your local real estate market. And we would not be here without the support of our friends and family over at Service Station Equipment, Martin and Dougie Braun, Tankman, and all the boys and girls over there. We are wishing them the happiest of Thanksgiving leading into this week. And Martin, I hope you're giving them a couple extra days off. They've been out there working hard to see the trucks all over the road. Those guys do not stop. And if you need any residential tanking help, you can reach out to 1-800-801-TANK. Ask for Dougie Braun, the Tank Man. He will come right over, show you the latest and greatest in residential oil tanks, and definitely want to make sure you get those taken care of. So if you're getting your furnace serviced, have them take a quick look at your tank. If it needs to get replaced, do it now. Don't wait till the middle of January, February when it's freezing cold and you're without heat for a couple days. Reach out to Service Station Equipment at 1-800-801-TANK and ask for the Tank Man. We're gonna have to get the Tank Man on for an interview. It's been way too long. Because I would love to hear, what's his go-to Thanksgiving.
We could probably have him call in. He doesn't have to drive down to the studio.
No, we'll get him to call in. All right, Dougie Braun, if you're listening, shoot me or Byron a text. We want you on the show. We want to hear what's going on in your world, and we just want to catch up with you. It's been a minute, man. But before we went to break, we were talking about rates, and I had a question for Skelly during the break, and I wanted him to answer it here. So since the election, the stock market has got a fire under its behind, we will say, but interest rates haven't really been affected. And to my understanding, usually the more confidence that investors have in bonds and in stocks, that can kind of help to either drive rates up or down, right? Lack of confidence, rates tend to go up. More confidence, rates tend to go down. So why do we think that isn't having anything to do with the current interest rates in the housing market?
Good question. So the stock market and the mortgage rate market are loosely correlated. Like sometimes they move in opposite directions, sometimes they move in the same direction. So, and this market has been weird. It's not, if you listen to some of the, people that are smarter than me that have podcasts and talking about the professional economists.
Do they have live radio shows?
I'm like an economist part-time here when I'm not doing mortgages, but there's folks that actually do this full-time. And historically, like if you asked me this question years ago, I would generally say that when there's good news about the economy, generally that causes stock market to go up and causes mortgage rates to go down.
Right.
And generally that's true. But not always. So, really what drives mortgage rates is investors' expectations about what interest rates will be in the future.
Okay.
So
forecasting.
So if you're, or just kind of like, so if picture yourself, you're an investor. You've got, let's say you manage somebody's pension,
sure,
like the firefighter's pension, and you have, $1 billion to invest, and you could take some of that money and you could put it into stocks, or you could put it into a fixed rate investment, such as a bond or a mortgage. So the way bonds and mortgages work is they're relatively safe investments. Not a huge fluctuation in the rate of return. Like you buy that bond or you buy that mortgage, and if you're buying a mortgage that's generating 7%, you're going to get 7%.
Right.
So then the value of that asset depends on what you think rates are going to be in the future. So if you think rates are going up in the future, that would impact your desire to buy that asset or not. And so, but stocks is different. It's just so complicated. Stocks, what drives people to buy stocks? I mean, I guess if you think the economy is going to do well,
right,
then generally that makes stocks more attractive, because if the economy is going to be growing, you're going to buy stocks because that'll have a greater rate of return. Whereas if you think maybe we're going into a recession, and the economy is going to be shrinking or getting smaller, then stocks become less attractive, and generally putting your money into bonds and mortgages becomes a safe thing to do. And so generally when we go into a recession like in 2008, mortgage rates go down because everybody wants to put their money into these safe fixed rate investment like bonds and mortgages, and that makes rates go down. So like when we've been talking about unemployment recently, when unemployment comes out and unemployment goes up, then people say, oh, okay, unemployment's going up. That could cause the economy to shrink and not grow as quickly. Therefore, stocks might take a hit. We're going to put our money somewhere safe. So, I mean, if you mentioned that the stock market's going up since the election, pull up a graph, if you could, of the last 6 months of, the Dow Jones. Was there a spike after the election? Absolutely. I mean, it was at, I'll give you the numbers for the listeners. You guys are driving your car. You can't pull up the graph. So November 4th, the Dow was at 41,956. On the 11th, it shot up to 44,000. That is a pretty big increase. It dipped back down a little bit to 43,000 on the 19th. That's not the first time it's going up. I mean, if you also look at, let's say, September 6th, the Dow was at 40,000. And then 2 weeks later, it went up to 42,000. And then mortgage rates were going up at that time. And then there was another increase. I mean, if you go back to August 5th, the Dow was at 38,000. And then a few weeks later, it went up to 41. So, I mean, even if you pull back and you look at maybe 3 years of the stock market, I mean, it's just been chugging along and doing pretty well. I mean, if you go back to like October of 2023, the stock market was at 33,000 and now it's at 44.
44, yeah.
So I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of a blip that I'm sure is election related, but I think even if we didn't have an election, it was kind of on that path. I mean, it's just, the economy is doing pretty well. I mean, relatively speaking, even though unemployment went up a little bit and there was some concern that we could go into a recession because the Fed was raising rates, they more or less have achieved the soft landing that we were back in 2022.
Even though we're not at 2%, we're at 2.4.
Yeah,
right?
So they've gotten inflation pretty low, not quite as low as they wanted. And unemployment did go up, but not as bad as it could have been. Like there was some concern that when you start cranking up those rates, like you could see like 8-9% unemployment, and in 2009, 2008, in the Great Recession, I think unemployment was around 12 or 13%. During the Great Depression, unemployment was over 30%. So like 1 in 3 people couldn't find a job during the Great Depression. So when you compare it to something like that, 4% unemployment, still relatively pretty low. And if you look at the GDP growth, if you pull up it's been a couple of years since we had a negative quarter. So pretty much, I think last quarter was like 2.6.
It was 2022 when we had 2 down quarters, and that's when they decided to change the definition of recession. I'm using air quotes here for you guys listening out there. They changed the definition of a recession back in 2022 because we had more than 2 down quarters in a row, but we weren't in a recession.
I don't know if we did. Hang on, I got to pull up the code. Let's pull it up. GDP,
pull it up, and because yes, unemployment is low. We know that. So that means a lot of people have jobs, and one generation in particular has jobs, but still can't afford housing because of these rates. And after you pull this up, we're going to tell you all about that generation and who they are and what it's forcing them to do.
Yeah. Well, so even though, it's relatively not that difficult to get a job, which has been good for wage growth. I mean, wage growth has been growing. Inflation is not good for consumers, and the general American that's just trying to pay their bills is feeling it for sure. And we talked about that on our election episode. I think, we talked about how any president who's been in the White House during a period of inflation is very difficult to get reelected because, that's just a huge burden on the American consumer. That it's tough. We had, I'm looking back. This is not quarter. Well, we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to it. But let's
go ahead, move on to your next topic there. What do we got?
Now let's talk about Gen Z.
Okay.
1 in 3 young adults
now.
still live with their parents due to lack of housing affordability. CNBC reports that 1 in 3 U.S. adults aged 18 to 34. We are that old. There's like another there's 2 classes like below us now, right?
Well, I have to ask everybody their date of birth when I do a mortgage application. Yeah. I'm starting to see date of birth
2000
in the 2000s.
That is
which is
wild.
really making me feel old. I'm 42 years old, which is not that old, but I mean, I remember I started in the mortgage business when I was 22.
Wow.
And in those days,
So 33%.
Things have changed.
Yeah,
Things have
33% of adults aged 18 to 34 live with their parents, with financial challenges like high living costs and economic shocks driving the trend. Millennials and Gen Z struggle with low savings, while some, like Victoria Franklin, save up to 50% of their income by living at home. I mean, if mom and dad have a finished basement and you've got your own entry to come in and out, I don't.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
And I think, you got to kind of get creative when housing is expensive and your goal is to buy a home. Making some sacrifices in the short term for your lifestyle will pay off in the long run. Considering roommates, I think, is a good thing to think about. I know it's nice to have your own space, but if you're in your 20s and you want to buy a house, or even if you're in the 30s, or any age really, if you want to go Golden Girl style, in your 40s. Well, the Golden Girls were only in their 40s. Some of them
that's wild. They look like they're in their 70s.
Speaking of feeling old.
And I do want to be very specific about this, because they're not just living at home to live off of their parents. It boils down to the cost of living, right? It's really expensive to rent. I saw a stat the other day. It was actually another mortgage lender from somewhere not in Connecticut. They posted that they couldn't get somebody approved for a $3,000 a month mortgage payment, but that same individual was paying $3,500 a month in rent.
Oh, all the time. I talk to people who are paying really high rents
and can't get a mortgage.
Sometimes they don't qualify for the mortgage. They're like, but I'm paying this month already. And I have to explain to them, that the way mortgage lenders calculate it is that essentially most loan programs, your total monthly payments has to be less than 50% of your monthly income. So if you make $6,000 a month, half of your income's $3,000 a month, you got a $500 car payment, and you've got $100 a month for credit cards, maybe $200 for student loans.
Yep.
That only leaves you with maybe $2,200 or whatever it is that you can do for a mortgage. And so that's how it works.
And right, with the rates being over 7, this is where we're kind of spending so much time on this, right? You're not going to be able to afford a median priced house. I mean, especially here in the state of Connecticut, out in the Midwest. Yeah.
And so we're seeing more and more multi-generational households too. So sometimes people that don't qualify on their own, they might say, oh, I'm going to have my son live with me. I'm going to have my mom, anybody. So, and a lot of people are doing that, and you got to do what you got to do in these times.
That's right. So Gen Z, we hear you, we see you. We're doing what we can here on Real Estate Radio to help you with the housing affordability. And when we come back, we'll have the One Team Weekly Rewind on 94.9 News Now and Stimulating Talk.